So while Donald Trump was escalating tariff threats against South Korea, specifically floating increases up to 25% on key imports, Canada was finalizing a major industrial agreement with Seoul. And the deal wasn't symbolic, it wasn't diplomatic theater, it was about manufacturing electric vehicles, batteries, critical minerals, and hydrogen technology, the backbone of future industrial power. And this agreement was signed by Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly and South Korea's Minister of Trade and Industry Kim Jong-kwon. But what really matters isn't the signatures, it's the intent behind them. South Korea is one of the world's most export-dependent advanced economies. The United States has traditionally been its most important destination, but when that destination becomes politically unstable, and when access can be restricted based on legislative disputes or election cycles, rational actors don't wait, they adapt. And the market understood this immediately. So when Trump announced the tariff escalation, South Korean auto stocks reacted violently. Hyundai Motor dropped nearly 5% and Kia fell more than 6%. And Hyundai Mobis lost around 5%. That's billions of dollars erased in hours. Not because of declining demand, but because the US trade environment is now viewed as unreliable. Now look at the structural mismatch Canada and South Korea are both facing. So South Korean automakers control roughly 12% of the Canadian vehicle market, and yet they manufacture nothing inside Canada. At the same time, Canada's historic automotive integration with the US is under pressure, and tariffs are fracturing supply chains that took decades to build. And Canada needs new manufacturing partner, Korea needs geographic diversification, and those incentives align perfectly. So Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney made the strategy explicit. Automakers that build vehicles inside Canada will receive preferential access to the Canadian market, and this isn't an experimental policy. Canada ran the same playbook in the 1980s to attract Japanese manufacturers, and today around 70% of Canadian auto assembly is Japanese, the result of those earlier decisions. And South Korea sees the lesson clearly. If you build in Canada, you don't just access Canadian consumers, you gain a North American production base that is less exposed to US tariff volatility, and that's not a short-term hedge, that's a generational decision. Now layer in defense, because this is where the strategy becomes impossible to ignore. At the same time as these automotive discussions, South Korea is competing for a massive Canadian submarine contract. The headline value is $41.4 billion, but defense analysts know the real number is far larger. Over 30 to 40 years, including maintenance, upgrades, and operation, the total cost could exceed $100 billion. This isn't about submarines. In finance, defense contracts often serve as anchors. They lock in long-term relationships, workforce training pipelines, and supplier ecosystems. And South Korea is using that logic deliberately. A South Korean consortium led by Hanwha has already signed a separate agreement with Algoma Steel, committing $275 million toward a new steel facility. And steel is not the end product here, it's the input. And this is vertical integration, preparing the industrial base needed for vehicle defense, equipment, and advanced manufacturing. Seen together, these moves aren't random, they are coordinated. And Canada isn't stopping with Korea. In just 6 months, Ottawa has signed 12 new economic and security agreements, and Canada is actively expanding trade relationships with India, Asian nations, and South America. And most strikingly, Canada slashed tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% to just 6.1%, allowing nearly 49,000 vehicles per year, in exchange for China reducing tariffs on Canadian agriculture exports worth over $7 billion annually. Washington reacted exactly as we expected. Trump threatened Canada with 100% tariff if it deepened economic ties with China. But here's the key detail: Canada didn't reverse course, instead, it accelerated diversification. That tells you everything. For decades, American economic power rested on one assumption: access to the US market was indispensable. That assumption allowed Washington to use tariffs as leverage. But leverage only works when alternatives don't exist, and Canada's strategy is to build those alternatives systematically. And the consequences extend far beyond Canada. So in 2024 alone, the United States imported $131.6 billion in goods from South Korea, and every tariff threat forces Korean firms to rethink production geography, not next year, not after election, immediately. And this isn't limited to Korea. Trump has threatened European nations over Greenland, Canada over China, and Mexico repeatedly. Even when tariffs aren't implemented, the damage is done. Companies must plan for multiple scenarios, they must add redundancy, they must invest in flexibility. All of that reduces the efficiency of US centered supply chains, and once capital moves, it doesn't snap back. When Hyundai built a plant that's a 20 to 30 year commitment, and facilities don't reallocate because a president leaves office. If Korean automotive production migrates to Canada, that shift becomes permanent, and US exporters face a lasting competitive disadvantage in the Canadian market. And the same logic applies to defense. If South Korea wins the submarine contract, decades of industrial integration, training program, supplier lock-in follow. All of it reduces US influence over time. We have seen this movie before, and during Trump's first term, steel and aluminum tariffs raised cost for American manufacturers. Job losses in metal-consuming industries exceeded gains in steel production, and the policy protected one sector while weakening many others. And this time the scale is larger and the effects more durable. So tariffs are not just taxes, they are signals. And signal the US is sending right now is unpredictability. So what happens next? First, we can expect additional South Korean investment announcement in Canada within months, likely in batteries or automotive component, politically aligned with defense cooperation. Second, further US tariff threats against Canada will likely backfire. Canadian leadership has already framed diversification as protection against economic coercion. That framing will justify deeper partnership, not retreat. And third, other US allies are watching closely: Japan and European manufacturers and Asian exporters. So if the Canada-Korea model works, it becomes a template, and the end result is simple but uncomfortable. Every tariff threat meant to assert American strength is teaching allies how to reduce exposure to the United States. What looks like leverage today is quietly eroding tomorrow's influence, and this isn't chaos, it's a pattern formation.